Many, including Robert Bly, have talked about the childlike nature of American and perhaps other Western cultures, that in many ways we become grown up, but still feel and relate to one another as children. And in a certain way, through the traumatic events of my relationship with the Human Awareness Institute, Peter Sandhill, Ann Watts, and the facilitator body in particular, I've come to taste for the first time what it means to be an adult, and to realize that in many ways I didn't know what that felt like. I didn't know how to use mental metrics to determine if I was or was not an adult. And most importantly, I didn't understand how and why a series of events led me to relate to life emotionally as a child, particularly in certain domains in reality. And there's these certain pockets where I've felt perpetually young and in a childlike relationship with the people around me, which is kind of a child-parent dynamic. And the amount of pain, the amount of trauma, and the amplification of all of those patterns through a series of abuse patterns in the relationship with the Human Awareness Institute facilitators in a therapeutic capacity has sparked over 1,000 hours of research and communicating, which is giving me a little bit of a better perspective that I want to deal with today. The first place I want to begin is, for those of you that don't know it, there are a number of templates that get formed in the 0 to 14-year-old range, and a lot of them in the pre-language to 7-year-old time frame. And one of these templates is the template of emotional regulation. And the way it's supposed to work, we have a mental, emotional, and physical body, is that our primary caregivers, our parents, and in many older cultures, our relatives and grandparents, would provide a continuity, a stable backdrop against which to feel feelings, in which to explore impact, and in so doing, learn a regulating pattern, a way to relate to every feeling inside of us, and a way to communicate those feelings in a way that they have voice, that they have impact in the culture. Now, this is absolutely essential for any individual, because particularly in a culture like ours, it is absolutely inevitable that every child will be put in a situation that will produce the full spectrum of feelings, from rage to panic to terror to shame to confusion to trauma. There are going to be things that happen in our culture that are going to elicit, as the impact of those events land on the scientific instrument of the human heart. And it's useful, just as an aside there, to step back and understand that in terms of biology, every feeling has a biological correlation. Every feeling memory has a correlation in the brain. And so while we, through language, partition feelings, body, and thoughts, the reality is that each of these integrate into the biology of the body, meaning there's nothing that happens to our body that doesn't affect our body. There is no thought that doesn't affect our body, and there is no feeling that doesn't affect our body, and there is no body sensation that does not affect our thoughts and our feelings, even if only to change the amplitude or the degree of narrowband or wideband focus. So these are really an integrated system. And the templates that we learn are around our feelings, are intended to provide us with a conscious awareness of the full spectrum of our feelings at the full spectrum of intensity, and to bring awareness through the scientific instrument of the human heart of what types of external what type of external influences produce what type of feelings. For example, if someone regulates their energy to the child and attunes to the child's density, to their mass, and to their rhythm, there is often an experience of happiness. That when you find the right way to regulate touch, to regulate sound, to regulate proximity, to regulate speed and volume with a child, and they feel that they are seen, they know that they are seen because the larger masses of the grown-ups around them, of the culture around them, are attuning themselves to the smaller and more fragile masses of the mental, emotional, physical body of the child. And when that happens, there is a joy as the body and the child relaxes, and the message is a deep one. The message is one that you matter. You matter because it's a choice for a superior mass, a grown-up, to regulate themselves to the child. They don't have to. A single grown-up can kill an infant in a few seconds with no ability of the infant to stop that violation of rhythm, that violation of pattern that is the energy system of the child. And so to the degree that the external environment regulates itself to show respect, responsiveness to the needs, and it's worth mentioning that we do have human needs, not just oxygen, though that's essential, not just liquid, though that's essential, not just touch, though that's essential, not just food, not just a certain temperature, that we have the need in all of its many manifestations to survive, to feel secure, to feel a sense of love and belonging. And it is the willingness or unwillingness of the superior masses in the form of the grown-ups and the culture and the physical environment around the child that determines how much the child needs to adapt, suppress, deny, adjust, and respond to the outer environment, and how much the outer environment needs to survive, needs to adjust and attune, etc., to the child. The underlying message of attunement is that you matter, because particularly for someone young, it is a free choice. A single older brother, a single older sister, aunt, uncle, parent, school teacher can end the life of a child with relative ease. And they can also violate, shame, overwhelm emotionally and mentally the mental, emotional reality and body of a child with relative ease. Now, in a chauvinistic culture, where the external, the yang, the physical, is elevated in consciousness and value, and the yin, the feminine, the inner world, particularly feelings, are diminished in value and in prominence. Physical abuse is treated as more important than psychological abuse. This is an interesting correlation because most of us, if we understood the data, would choose to have an arm amputated with a healthy psychology capable of loving ourselves, of relating to ourselves, of achieving our various goals, which more and more in our culture do not require both hands to plow a field or something like that, but we're in the tapping and texting, etc. Most of us would be better off if we could switch the toggle back and forth to a fully healed amputation of even both legs, or the damage of self-loathing, self-shame, traumatization, and PTSD of a fully functioning physical body in a chronic tailspin of psychological pain that renders us unable to be the people we want to be, unable to feel the way that we want to feel, and unable to accomplish and grow in the ways that we want to grow and accomplish. The psychological wound is a more significant wound, and in our culture, it's also a more invisible wound. And we can see that in the way that if you've got both legs cut off, the sociopathic element of our culture does shame, humiliate, and marginalize our disabled people, the sociopathic element in our culture. But the more rational and healthy elements of our culture will accommodate and be interested in accommodating the obvious, in our cultural framework, the obvious abuse and disability of amputated legs, and would consider it inhumane to ignore that and invite an amputee to climb up stairs as if they had legs, and then tell them to hurry up when they were falling behind, having to crawl on hands, on hands and elbows up the step to compensate for our lack of human dignity. That cannot be said in the mental emotional terrain, where we repeatedly shame and abuse and blame individuals for expressing and living the symptoms of sustained chronic mental emotional abuse. Now remember, this is a little bit of an artificial distinction, because the patterns of thinking and feeling have been laid into the biology, often in a template or region of the biology that is no longer conscious. Many of our templates form before language. And there's an interesting thing about consciousness and language, and it's that we are not conscious of what has no words. And we don't remember what has no words. Meaning, try and remember something that you have no words for, and invariably you're left with a blank stare. Because memory is linked with language. Conscious memory is linked with consciousness, and consciousness is linked with language. So for every template that is formed pre-verbally, we don't have a conscious memory to relate to the feelings and the biological patterns that were set in those places. Now, some of us are fortunate in very rare instances in our culture, to actually relive a birth scenario with adult consciousness such that we can put language to what it felt like to come out into the world, what it felt like to be met with beeping noises and glaring lights and rhythms of this speed and that speed, what it felt like to be treated in this way and this way that was so dissociative, so disconnected from the slow and graceful rhythms of our own infant body, that the message provided was extreme worthlessness, because the innate underlying message to attunement or lack of attunement is one of value. We don't attune to anything that we don't value. And to a great extent in our culture, we attune to what we fear. If we look at an enormous amount of our activities and add up all of the activities that relate to trying to look good because we fear rejection, abiding laws, we may not particularly like paying taxes to this government for how it's going to spend our tax money, but the fear of losing everything, the fear of being written up in the newspaper and put in jail and having our jobs stolen or whatever because and our bank account seized because we didn't pay taxes, and the fear of being out on the street and not having this, and the fear of, we pay an incredible deference in this culture to what we fear. And with an infant, there can be those fears, or it can be swept aside in the much louder clanging of daily traumas, daily anxieties, daily coping strategies and fears of grown-ups who do not or cannot value the visceral experience of an infant enough to attune to it and communicate through that attunement that you matter. You matter enough for me not to go into work today because I can feel what it does to your body to leave you alone or in a strange new environment before you've learned what's going on. You matter enough to turn the volume of what's going on down to this level that your new sensitive ears are learning to adjust to. You matter enough to not have bright LED lights and this and that because looking good with my new decor is less important than you feeling comfortable getting to know your senses in my world. The fact that our consciousness in Western culture is so linked to language means that the pre-verbal state is almost completely invisible within the culture because it's invisible in consciousness. And as templates get formed in that domain, the templates are unconscious. And how a healthy template gets formed is in a regulated and attuned dance with a stable outside force, so that we can see what happens as we try this, so that we can see how the adults, or I should say grown-ups, given the strong absence of adults, how they respond around us. As we experience rhythmic and attuned relationships, mentally, emotionally, and physically, we develop a dial where we learn. 2-year-olds are going through this, where they learn what has what effect. And for the dial to be a useful template for life and engaging with reality, it has a gentle bell curve where let's say you're dealing with fire. Here you are, you feel a little bit of warmth. You move in 10%, it'll be 10% more hot. You move in 10%, it'll be 10% more hot. In a healthy bell curve, you're dealing with a sane backdrop. And you're the thing that changes. And you learn what creates what result. Aha, I burn myself if I go here. And I'm in control because I can decide the distance. And so fire becomes safe when I have a healthy, attuned, bell curve relationship with it. And I'm aware of that. Now, the emotional bell curves are really what I'm talking about around adulthood. In a healthy, mature culture, in a healthy and mature family, first of all, every feeling is understood as a scientific readout. It's like if there's anger present, it usually means you need something, you want something, and it's hitting resistance. Road rage on the car. You want to go fast, and a car cuts in front of you, and right as you want to speed up, you actually have to slow down to accommodate the fact that someone cut in front of you. And in a culture like ours, where we are emotionally illiterate, where you can go through the entire culture, from parent to teacher to school, to the general experience of socializing in the culture, to work, and sometimes even to therapy, and then deal with government, and not have a single healthy map, a single healthy bell curve for dealing with feelings. You can go through this entire network of relationships in our culture and not be given an emotional map, let alone experience an emotional map where, as something does this and it makes you angry, you feel the anger, and the anger is held in the environment and understood and attuned with. And as you want something even more and it's blocked even harder, you feel more angry. And that also is held and understood so that you are known in your values, in your momentum, in your aspirations, in your experience as it intersects with the environment through anger. That the intensity of anger correlates to the intensity of resistance, where the environment, the human beings, the objects, the weather, etc., blocks what you long for, what you value, what's important to you. And where loneliness is also an intersection between the individual and the parts that they know in themselves and the parts that are mirrored and honored and attuned to on the outside. In other words, if I, as an American man, know a part of myself that is innocent and that wants to play with children and likes to smile, and I connect with that part in an American park, and I smile, because there's a joy around being near that innocence and that beauty. And there's a goodness, there's a truth in that relationship. When that is honored by parents around that say, this is something good. This is something good in you. I see the part in you that sees the beauty in my child that I love. I can tell that in your eyes. I can tell it in your face. I can tell it in your behavior. Then that part doesn't feel alone. when instead that part is covered with a projection, very common in the United States, where the more innocence and warmth there is with the child, and this is an area of sexism, and so it's more common with men. But if I express that part of myself to be met with hostility and fear, and what is seen in me is not what I'm feeling, is not my intention, but is a projected pedophile, seen with fear and hatred. And in the United States, I've done experiments and discovered that I have about 10 seconds tops to be innocent with a child in a park or outside or on the street. I have 10 seconds to be innocent with a child before the parent escalates their fear. And so that part feels alone. Because it is alone. Because it is not being met as it is. It's not being seen for what it is. It is not being responded to for what it is. It is being met for what it is feared to be, for what it is not, which is a form of dissociation from what is to associate with the fears and the projection of the culture. In that situation, grief, sadness, loneliness is a scientific reading that tells you you're in an environment in which who you are is not accurately read. It is covered with fears of who you are not. In that environment, where that can be addressed and say, hey, I am not the person that you are afraid that I am. And the culture responds with humility, with openness. There is hope. When that, hey, I am not the person you think I am, is met with intensified fear and panic in the eyes of an emotionally illiterate culture, then that impulse to right the asymmetry between what's inside and what's perceived is filled with despair. Because if you're in a loop where the more you try and right the imbalance, the less you are seen for who you are and the thicker the projection is done, because all you have to do is say things like, anyone who is emotional is a little odd. And then if they get emotional because you think they're odd for having emotions, then they're dangerous. So as soon as you've written the script that way, now every emotional person is not viewed as a tactile matrix of data that is easy to read and respond to and create value with, but they're viewed as someone to be avoided. And if they're too dumb to know that we avoid emotional people, then they're viewed as dangerous. And if they get emotional about that, then they're freaks. Well, that cycle is a cycle of despair. There's no way out of it. Because if you get really frustrated, it's like, hey, look at me. Hey! And they call 911, right? Because now you're an abuser. There's complete futility. The readout of the human heart in specific environments produces feelings that tell us the lay of the land. You are in a funnel created by your culture, bought into by the majority within the culture, that if you express this part of who you are, you get treated like this. And if you're angry about that, you get treated even worse. And if you try to make a fuss about how absurd that is, you are completely dissociated and disowned. And this is done so unconsciously because it's in that template region of the cult that people don't even realize that there's another way to do things. Which is why I fly 18-hour flights to Thailand so that I can play with children, where their parents smile at me, where their parents say, "Why you so smart, foreigner?" "Good. You like play with children. Very smart. I like." And they smile because they know that an intelligent person would love their kids as much as they do. So I must be intelligent because I'm showing interest in their kids. Well, obviously, I feel differently because I'm in a completely different cultural matrix in which I'm a human being for behaving warmly towards children rather than a threat that has to be eliminated at all costs for showing interest in children. The heart will accurately represent that data. The mind will also create either, the data will be represented in the feelings. It feels painful. It feels painful to show warmth, to smile, to be kind to someone, and to have it met with fear and hostility. That is a painful feeling. It's just telling us there's an asymmetry here. It's telling us we're not seen. It's telling us we don't belong. And we are pack mammalian species that have a need for survival, security, and love and belonging isn't just an isolated thing. In a human-made culture, if you don't have love and belonging, you don't have survival and security. If people hate you on a planet dominated by people, and you don't belong, it's very difficult for you to survive. And we can see that with our millions of American homeless, in which they would be welcome in any business in America if they had money. They don't have money, so they are not welcome in 99% of the businesses. They are treated as subhuman because they don't have bits of paper. If they had money, they would be in houses, and 42% of them wouldn't have PTSD from traumatic experiences of being chased by cops and raped and this and that and the other. But they don't have money. So they are treated subhumanly. That has emotional, that creates feelings on anyone who sees it. Now you can tune it out and numb it out. But anyone who sees that knows at some level, I see if I lose all my bits of paper for some reason, my back breaks, I give it away to a stranger who needs it more. If I lose my bits of paper, first I will be thrown out on the street. Then I will be hunted like an animal, and my feelings will cease to matter because those bits of paper are more important than I am. And that's sad because it feels good to know that I'm worth more than a bit of paper. And it feels sad to know that I'm in a culture, that I'm in a cult, where if I don't have the paper, I'm unwanted. But if I have the paper, I'm wanted, which means I'm not wanted. The paper is wanted. So I have no value at all. The paper has value. Which is why if I walk into a business without that paper, they'll give me dirty looks. Can I help you with anything? You're not going to give me some money? Well, then get out of here. My story doesn't have value. My presence doesn't have value. My feelings don't have value. My paper has value. And I'm surrounded by people who will follow that code, that value hierarchy, paper over people, paper over people. And it feels sad. There's a loneliness because there's some part in me that knows that I and other people are more valuable than bits of paper. But I'm in a cult in which that part does not get honored, in which that cult, that part of me, is invisible. It is marginalized. Oh, yes, we're all one. Yeah. But do you have paper? Then get out of my store. Do you have paper? Then get out of my house. There's a loneliness for that part that is not honored and respected. Now, I was born into a family with two emotionally dissociative people, meaning they were born into a family and a culture in which they could go from parent to teacher to school to culture to work to therapist to government without anyone sitting them down and teaching them emotional regulation, what the map of feelings were, what they meant, teaching them their feelings mattered, teaching them how they could have a big impact or a small impact, doing it based on this and this. No one sat either of my parents down in this entire culture. Instead, there were a tremendous number of experiences where violence and harm was done to them, where if they expressed the natural feelings as a result of those things being done, they would be punished. And this gets into an abusive relationship because the human heart is an instrument. Its purpose is to broadcast data. As an infant, you're put down in a dissociative, noisy environment. You see, the human body wasn't designed for cars to rush by at 70 miles an hour. We have created that out of dissociation from the rhythms of our body. The human body wasn't designed to sit at a desk and tap away and glare at a screen. So our body communicates feedback. It starts to get fat, it starts to get lethargic, it starts to get irritable, starts to go numb because we're abusing the body. When the infant is crying and we respond not by changing the environment into one, because you see there are tribal environments in which children rarely cry. Shepherds raising cashmere goats in the mountains will not put an infant down. For years, there's a bond. And the rhythm of their life is such, those infants don't cry. And they have a secure, attached relationship where they understand their relationship with the adults around them. Our environment, not so much. So in the dissociation from the emotional body and the environment that we've created, we are facilitating the human heart to communicate pain, to communicate anger, to communicate shock, to communicate loss in the pre-verbal language of a child. Now, when that's met with giving whiskey to a child, giving them an addictive thing to divert them, giving them food that makes them fat, giving them sugar, with sedatives, or with other direct forms of violence, shaking them, shouting at them, closing their mouth, putting them in a room somewhere else. The things we do because we've got to be normal human beings living our life, and this fucking infant is getting in the way. So let's just do this. When we do that, the child goes insane in a certain part when the entire outer world refuses to regulate to the cues that it's giving through the scientific instrument, the human heart and the human body. There is no way to have that done repeatedly at intense levels and for a child to grow up feeling like they matter as a being. They may grow up and realize that they matter because they can type a computer, because nobody violates them when they're typing and working hard in the office, because they get promoted and people care about the thoughts and ideas they have in that context. But there is no way to repair the fundamental foundation of being that says my feelings do not matter just because I feel them. My life doesn't matter just because I'm here. Who I am, my experience doesn't matter. What matters is the fact that I can type and make these people money. Which is why we have a curious phenomena as I travel around the world, in which Americans often feel more insecure in who they are emotionally than most cultures on the planet, while being more confident and arrogant in their productivity. In other words, they feel insecure about their value as a human being, but they feel very secure and confident about their value as money-making machines in an enterprise. And one has to ask oneself, what if the underlying being has no value? How do you build on that and say that the bits of paper created by that being has value? Because if there is no being, it was the being that created the idea of money in the first place. Now, when a child is regularly dissociated, let's say your parents can't deal with the idea that they make a mistake, because every time they made a mistake as children, they were shaken, they were hated, they were punished, they were treated in a way that left them afraid for their lives, left them feeling unwanted, which is worse often than death for the emotional body, to feel disgusting. So they learned that they couldn't survive if they made mistakes, which means they've built a whole framework of adaptation around avoiding the appearance of or actually making mistakes. And then they're given an infant by a culture that says, you can have sex without a condom. You must be able to raise an innocent child. Go ahead, just do it. And you are set up to make thousands of mistakes. But if every time you communicate that your parent has made a mistake, they've stuffed the food in too strong, or they haven't given you enough, or they've put too much sugar in your body, or they've left you alone and you've gone into dysregulate, you're supposed to measure your breathing, etc., to the mother, and now you can't regulate because you've lost that rhythm. And the deep message of every mammal that is separate from their caregiver is, I'm going to die. And when that's put aside consciously, the message is, it doesn't matter if I die or not. When the parent can't face their own feelings around making a mistake, when the child communicates that they make a mistake, the parent may punish the child, may coerce the child, may manipulate the child, may sedate the child in a way that it becomes clear facially from the face reading program of the infant that it is not safe for my survival to communicate the truth that my parent is making a mistake. Because the purpose of communicating that my parent is making a mistake is to refine the survival algorithm in the attunement process. But that's not what happens with my parents. My parents get frantic as if they're not going to survive themselves. They feel unlovable. They hate me. They go into all kinds of bizarre compulsive behaviors every time I communicate this bit of data. And so, I'm going to have to suppress this impulse. I'm going to have to turn the switch on anger. I'm going to have to turn the switch on questioning and curiosity, because it regularly provokes a traumatic response in the parent, which threatens my life. So the science, the instrument, which is like a 360-degree vision, when you can experience every feeling at every intensity, past, present, and future, and correlate it with the outer environment, you have got the equivalent of a very accurate depth intensity reading of the environment. When that's taken offline to accommodate the dysfunction and the incompetent of the grown-up who's raising you, you lose the ability to regulate and learn this nice gentle bell curve. And what you get instead, having gone through the pre-verbal state and the verbal state into the teenage years, learning at a deeper and deeper level that we don't talk about these things in the family, that we don't feel these feelings, that these feelings have no basis for existence, that anyone who has these feelings isn't welcome, that anyone who says these things doesn't belong. This is such a traumatic message for the child, the infant, etc., that they must dissociate from themselves and convince themselves that that part is horrible and doesn't exist, so that they can feel like they belong in a dysfunctional system. Now, the problem with this is that the human heart is intended to give readings. When that evolutionary process is shut down and clogged with soot of panic and fear and confusion and insanity and overreactivity, or more often, I remember with both of my parents trying to find the point where I existed but was not hated, because I would be invisible, and I was still invisible. I was invisible, and I was invisible, and then I'd get into the danger zone. And what I'd be trying to find is the point where I would exist but not be hated. But that's not how my parents' feelings worked. So I would work my way slowly up the bell curve with zero feedback, willfully ignored, excluded, etc. And then the moment I did this one thing that crossed some invisible line that I existed, then I would be hated with a violent force that was overwhelming and dissociative. And as soon as they'd pushed me away with that force, then I didn't exist again. And the hatred disappeared. And then the hatred was denied. Like, no, I don't hate my children. No, there's nothing. Like it never happened. And what this creates is a template where, rather than a nice gentle slope which you feel control over, it creates a template of feeling in which I'm going along, I don't feel anything, and then suddenly I feel everything and it's completely overwhelming. Now, this is a shape that is very difficult to connect with other people emotionally and socially. It's a cliff shape. You don't get to walk up and down and find the right temperature on a gradual slope. You're walking along, it's all one temperature, then you fall off the cliff. You're in shock, and it's a completely different temperature. It's one or the other. These templates are systematically engineered by traumatized and dissociative people living in traumatized and dissociative culture. And it is a disability because it's like having a stereo where you can have it on maximum volume or nothing. Which one do you want? You don't want either. You don't want to be deafened, and you don't want to be empty. You want a midpoint. Now, when the templates happen pre-verbally, and most of the emotional templates do before words are formed, they are outside of the rational domain, which leaves me in a situation where I absolutely know that the people I'm dealing with do not want to have a 0, and they do not want a 10. They want a 4, or they want a 6, or they want 7. And I absolutely know that I can't give them a 4, a 6, or a 7. I know what they want. And I know it would be beneficial if I gave it to them. That is not the issue. The issue is that particular template with its sheer face is outside of the conscious mind in a culture that is not only not going to help with that is not only not going to preclude this abuse cycle, but if I, raise a hand and say, I'm going from being completely separate to being completely needy in 1 hour, I would like to spread that out over a month. Anyone got any ideas? In an intelligent culture with adults, any disability is understood as a liability to the matrix, to the whole. If you think that it is intelligent, and here we have to define something that our culture will not define for us. Intelligence is the efficiency of turning energy into human well-being. Now, there is no question that being able to regulate need, or regulate fear, or regulate energy levels is a very useful skill that's going to benefit hundreds of thousands of people, because each individual is going to have contact with hundreds of thousands of people. So hundreds of thousands of people will benefit if every individual in the matrix has regulation skills. It is intelligent for adults to participate in a resolution of this at a scientific level, at a preclusion level. It is intelligent for adults observing this to insist that every child in our culture gets parenting training and psychological training. Now, part of the problem comes when a traumatic and traumatizing culture associates normalcy or the status quo with survival, security, and belonging, and equates thinking and intelligence as abnormal because nobody's doing it. Now, you will hear grumbling that, couldn't we teach kids some better subjects here? You will hear a few thoughts here and there, like, when's the last time you used algebra? How about trigonometry? Calculus? You mean when you were raising your children, when you were cooking, when you were driving to work, you didn't use calculus? I see. How about emotional literacy? Did you have feelings? Would that have been useful? Oh yeah, every single moment of every single day. Oh, I see. So you set up the education system to preclude a single hour of the single most useful skill in daily life. And then to make sure that people can't have feelings and have time to learn feelings on their own, you flood them with homework on stuff that 95% of people are not going to use a single day of their life other than to pass the test, which is supposed to show that they're competent to live. But because they've been studying subjects that are irrelevant to their daily life, at the expense of subjects that are essential to daily life, now they don't know how to think, because if they would have thought, this would have irritated them so much they might have dropped out. You look at the data. 20 parents come up to me and say, Dane, I wish my kids were like you. You're achieving goals. You're doing this. You know what you want. Wow, you're focused. It's like, yeah, it's true. I wish my kid was like you. Do you know? Well, the first thing they need to do is drop out of school. Secondly, they need to start studying these things. Oh, no, Dane. I don't want my kid to stop behaving and doing the things that are turning him into who he is. What I wish is that my kid could continue studying algebra and trigonometry in a mind-numbing cult of chauvinism and stupidity, but come out the other end knowing the things that you knew, studying completely different subjects. That's what I want. I want a completely different outcome from the same equation. I don't want to change the equation to say 10 plus 10 equals 20. No. I want to keep the 2 plus 2 element. I just want 20 to come out the other end. That's what I want. Now, as soon as I point this out to the parent, I am persona non gratis. Let's get rid of the data, because we want to live in an insane reality. Well, how's a kid supposed to grow up with parents that are so fucked up that given the obvious choice to think and make a choice, they'd rather stay insane and sell their kids out, even though they know they want the outcome to be different? You can't do anything with people that are this dumb. So what about the kids that are born thinking their parents are gods and following along? Now, the most irritating thing with this cliff-type dynamic, which I've got to deal with in multiple areas psychologically in my life, is the fact that we are so illiterate about psychology and biology in our culture that if I tell someone about this, they assume that if I know what I'm talking about here, I must be able to change it. Meaning, they think the problem was that they didn't think about any of this, but now that they've thought about it because I said something, it can just be changed. A nonverbal template can change like that. Why not? Meaning, we are so uneducated in our culture that we don't understand how much of our reality is created by the nonverbal part of our psyche. And we don't understand that if we raise people to dissociate from that part and to associate with the verbal part of the psyche, that once you've completed that partition, often by making the nonverbal part so painful that as soon as the conscious mind tries to bring language to the pain that's in that wound there, it gets flooded with pain and then retreats because everyone else is saying, no, nothing's going on, because they're staying outside of the nonverbal part of the psyche. Knowing this, I have absolutely no better chance of changing these regulation templates at all. If I did, I would have changed them decades ago. All I have is a greater appreciation of how important the nonverbal time frame is, and a grief that that time frame has passed for me. Now, it ties in here in another way. But a lot of what we're dealing with is intergenerational. And a lot of it is pre-verbal intergenerational. And the data points for this are coming from constellation therapy on the one hand, which looks at the way that, for example, a suicidal person who wants to die by incineration, meaning they're fantasizing about committing suicide by jumping into a vat of hot metal because they work in a steel mill or something. And that's what they want to do. And they don't want to live, and they feel depressed and this and that and the other. Someone who is in a suicidal state like this can shift out of that state when they become conscious of the family history of a relative burned and incinerated at Auschwitz, with all that grief, with all that depression and sadness of the family separation, being incinerated in a gas chamber. That when that story is integrated in the conscious mind, the pain and the grief is still there, but it is able to be placed in the appropriate place, that this is part of the history of this relative at this point in time. And it's not the feeling that this ego has in the present. A simple ritual around that awareness and the ability to place that at its appropriate verbal place in history. We have a culture of shadow denial. We have a culture of unhealthy and excessive positivity used as a denial pattern, to the where we don't talk about those family history events at table, so the kid grows up completely unconscious of the fact that that resonance is in the family system. And so they get confused when they feel it inside their body. And they start wondering, there must be something terribly wrong with my life if I want to jump into a vat of steel to feel incinerated. I am the one who needs to be incinerated. There must be something wrong with my life. And you look around and it's like, well, I guess so-and-so cut you off, so-and-so didn't give you a raise, so-and-so. It's like, yeah, that must be what leads to the desire to be incinerated. But if that were true, then when the ritual and the history was known, that person wouldn't feel great relief and no longer want to incinerate themselves and no longer feel crazy, because a part of that system was in their body that they now know where to place it. Yes, I'm aware of it, but that's where I need to place it. I need to place it as a peripheral awareness as part of my family history. The pain and the grief of that is not directly reflecting what's going on in my life today, so I no longer want to die. Well, when that works better than antidepressants, it pays to look at the paradigm of intergenerational abuse systems and family systems, family constellations, and that work. Now, there's another interesting thing that's been shown in, we do rather barbaric studies, a little bit sociopathic is our way of learning things, because we will not attune to that pre-verbal level that can know all of these things empathically. We don't attune to it there, so we learn a lot of things through torment and pain. And so one of the things that was done was a set of rats were exposed to cherry blossoms. And every time the cherry blossoms and the rats, every time the cherry blossom scent was given to the rats were given electric shocks. Pretty soon, the correlation of brain synapses, pretty soon, as soon as the cherry blossom scent was present, the rats would go into traumatic reaction, expecting and reliving the electric shock. Okay, we've tormented the first generation of rats into trauma and PTSD, correlating it with the scent of cherry blossoms. Well, there are parts in my body that feel grief. That this is the way we've mapped out to learn things in our culture. But there's no place to grieve this with you. Because in our cult, having established normalcy is survival, in our cult, men are not supposed to have feelings and certainly not care about rats. We're supposed to get to the point and carry on with the flow. But there is a part in my body that feels grief. And if I be a good boy and move past that grief, I may gain social ranking because I'm not emotional. I may gain social ranking for being intelligent, articulate, and sociopathic. But I've just taken on a message that says that life and animal well-being does not matter. What matters is scientific data. You see, there are some cultures where a hug and a cry would be nice right now. But that's not going to happen in this culture. And so the mantra continues. Survival and belonging by being normal. Or find yourself on the next sociopathic comedy skit where everything feminine is hammered again and again and again with no regard for dignity and feelings. Because in general, it feels good to disown the parts of us that are sad. But of course, we, in doing so, perpetuate the environments that create the sadness. What's important to understand with this study is that for 2 subsequent generations of rats, cherry blossoms produced an elevated traumatic response. And secondly, that the biology and the neurology of the brain, including cortisol levels, changed for 2 generations after. Many African Americans in this country have great-grandparents who were treated to sociopathic shame and humiliation and carry that residue in their body, amplified with a media environment in which they are aware viscerally of how their ancestors were treated. Now, if we had told the second generation of rats to stop being so irrational and stop reacting to cherry blossom scent, you fool. It's just a beautiful scent of a beautiful flower. we could be doing just that, as ignorantly and as inhumanely as telling our Native American youth who commit suicide at up to 20 times the rate of their counterpart, who commit suicide at up to 20 times the rate of the tribe that was not massacred, that was not treated like animals, didn't have their culture ripped away from them. That did not have a superior form of dignity and vitality replaced under force and deception and a whole host of betrayals. Only to be told that they can make whatever they want of their lives. And maybe you really are inferior if you are still dwelling on the past. Well, it's kind of interesting to me as a gardener and an awareness of, our different biological experiments. We don't shout at roses because they refuse to grow in the shade. The biologists wouldn't give the second generation rats a lecture on self-esteem. You are going to appreciate these cherry blossoms whether you like it or not. Your mother went out and got these cherry blossoms for you, and they were for you, and you shut up and you show gratitude to that thing, and you respond differently than your biology and your heart to feel the things that we want you to feel. We don't do that to roses, and we don't do it to rats. For that matter, our homeless people wandering around in the city who are considered lawbreakers if they lay down on the curb. Some of them take amphetamines because the humiliation and grief of being woken up unexpectedly by someone asking them to move along is so painful that they would rather walk around for 3 days nonstop on amphetamines than feel the grief and helplessness that rather than being extended help, they're asked to get up, exhausted, and move in the absolute knowledge that there is nowhere to go because we've made it illegal for them to sleep in their cars. We've made it illegal for them to sleep in the parks. We've made it illegal to sleep on the sidewalk. And we've made it illegal for them to build low-cost housing. Something you find out if you as a homeowner or a homeless person want to buy a $2,000 shed and fit it up nicely and sleep comfortably and pay a homeowner $100 a month to put it there in the garden. Your city will spend your tax money to evict that person because a low-cost house is against the law. But it is not against the law to systematically murder our homeless at a rate of 4 hours a day. Now, we may think deer have it bad, but a deer can wander around and lay down wherever it wants to without paying rent. And they do use our public parks, decimating the parks in many ways, uncontained as a species with wolves, decimating the parks, eating newly planted trees as an overpopulated species. They have more rights than a homeless person who might offer to sleep in the park and plant trees. Now, in a culture that buries its secrets, that buries its tragic events, we create a sack in the semi-conscious mind where the body lives the history of the unspoken family. carries the grief and guilt of great-grandfather so-and-so who ripped this person off, carries the shame of drinking of this relative back here, carries the depression of someone that was left out in the cold and died starving, and has no place to put those feelings, because we are part of the ecologies that give rise to us. We are one of the few species in nature, coming out of nature, who have managed to concoct the illusion that we have no part of nature. We have the illusion of independence, when absolutely nothing in this entire presentation could come without an environment that's been around for billions of years. No, I bought this shirt. You mean you sent bits of paper to someone who went out in nature and harvested material and wove it using technology that millions of people developed, using shipping technology that millions of people developed. So no, this does have a lot to do with your history and with your system of culture, your system of thinking, and the ecology in which you were born. And this body didn't just come out of nowhere either. It's regularly fed liquids, air, and nutrients from outside because it is a part of that system. And it didn't just pop out of nowhere either. It came from two parents who in turn came from other parents and other parents and other parents. And there is a scientific link between every single thing that I call me and every single thing that I call not me. Which really means we have to look at the cult that is so fanatical about delineating this line between what is me and what is not me when all the science says that there's a strong interconnectivity. We need language in order to go into this bag of unresolved energy and suppressed and denied energy and give it back to the various relatives, etc., that gave it to us so that we understand this is what I'm feeling from the present moment around this body, and that's what I'm feeling in the past around this thing that is part of my family system. But to do that, we need a paradigm. And one of the reasons we have so much mental emotional disease in the United States is it leads the world in its dissociation from the past and from the family. We dissociate from everything we don't like. We're among the most judgmental cultures in human history. And we dissociate more from our family and the past. Oh, no, that was in the past. You ask a girlfriend who you're getting to know, tell me about some of your patterns in the last 3 relationships with men that you've had. A good American will answer, oh, no, I'm done with that. That's in the past. Well, humor me. Were there any common ground between the last 3 relationships? Well, yes, they were all this and this and this. It's like, okay. And are you wanting to create that with me? No, that's in the past. Well, you're doing it. You've picked someone that could go there, and the way you're behaving, it's leaning us in that direction. Doesn't look like it's in the past to me. And how can we participate around it if we can't talk about it? Well, some get up and leave because they don't want to talk about it. And what the data shows is we relive the unconscious momentum of past patterns until we bring language and consciousness to them. Now, if we go back to this original thing about the childlike nature of an immature culture, or in Robert Bly's terms, a sibling society, where the child in each person, which one of the way you can tell a child is by the amount of self-centeredness. Another is by the degree, well, you can correlate self-centeredness with trauma, and you can also correlate it with the age of the child. The child is learning to survive and feel secure and get love and belonging. And until that is stable, until they can take care of themselves, a child will be incredibly self-centered. We can look at love. We have lust. I want to fuck you. Self-centered. I need you. Self-centered. I'm attached. I need you. I want you. I want to be together like this. I want to be companions like this. So we have the self-centered needs, like I think we look good together. I want you by my side. I want to have you in relationship with me. I want you to make me feel like this. So these are all self-referencing forms of love. You could call them child loves. We don't get into adulthood until we start asking the question, how can I support you to meet your needs of survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, self-development, giving back to the community, legacy, and transcendence? How can I be around you that brings out your essential self? Only an adult asks that question, because that's the only form of love that is not self-absorbed, that is not self-referencing. Because when an adult asks someone they want to support, they want to bring out the best in, how can I love and support you? What would bring out your best qualities? And the answer is, if you could just leave me alone and just stop this, I am so swamped with other opportunities that I can't take advantage of that right now. The adult says, great, thanks for telling me. There's no attachment. There's no investment. They've just learned that the best way they can serve that person is to let go of any concept of relating. And when that's the goal, that is the way the love that will be expressed, a comfortable withdrawal. Now, you can simulate adult love and put on an act. But the bottom line is that if human needs, and if the child has not had a chance to mature into an adult, that will be just an act. And if the person does accept the support, then after a while, it'll be, okay, what about me? I was just I was doing that, but you need to meet my needs now and do this and this and this. And so it will fall down and lead it to resentment and stuff of this nature. And we have this rampantly within our culture. It is incredibly rare. I'm trying to remember if I've ever met an adult in my life who ever asked that question. I'd like to be of service, to help you be your best self, to see you grow through your human needs to that point of transcendence. How can I help? What do you need? I don't think I've ever been asked. And when you have, the incestuous psychological and physical parental relationships with all of those different needs being met, to make the parent look good, to make sure the parent doesn't feel any shame, to make sure the parent doesn't see that they make mistakes, because if they do, they're unlovable because their child is unlovable, etc. This is the 90% plus framework of our culture. Now, I want to talk about the dark pit of loneliness, of despair, of unconsciousness, and of childlike regression that I've experienced most of my life, and the phenomena, the environmental phenomena that lead to that. The first step for me were two parents that couldn't bond emotionally. And for the impatient among you, if you think I'm talking about the past, no. The past is just giving context and perspective for the identical pattern in the present. And if you think I'm just talking about me, no. I'm talking about me because reality is fractal in nature. And if I do a good job of showing you me, you will see the pattern and be able to overlay it on yourself, on your lovers, on your past, on your future, etc. At least 80% of this is relevant to all our lives in some way or another, to some degree, with different degrees of urgency, depending on our focus at the time. Now, a lack of support, bonding, and regulation from two parents that are afraid to feel, because feelings got them constantly in trouble, because they were raised with parents in which feelings, the feedback of data, was viewed as the enemy. You see, in very unsophisticated environments, people are more scared of smoke detectors than they are of the fire. Feelings are the smoke detectors. Painful feelings, scary feelings, traumatic feelings. But they also alert everyone that something's going on. If you do not believe, for example, in an intergenerational incest pattern, sometimes the parents who are incestuously raping their children do not believe that they can change. They don't quite understand why they're doing it. They know it's wrong and bad and they'll get in trouble. You can't justify having sex with a 2-year-old as being a particularly satisfying, pleasurable experience. So it's this energy that's in the bag that is confused with the self. And one of the troubles with a traumatic culture is that the more sociopathic and traumatic the outer environment, the more you cling to identity as a sense of certainty. Well, if you're going to cling to identity, it's a good idea to know what that identity is. And in a culture that denies its shadow and its past, what you cling to is the undifferentiated chaos of your family system with all of its taboos, with all of its insanities, etc. And it feels familiar because you've grown up on it and you cling to it to protect yourself from the unknown. Trauma leads you directly to the gateway of the unknown. So if you step into the unknown And you are anticipating trauma because the past trauma was not resolved, because when you tried to communicate that it wasn't working for you, you were punished and slammed hard because you don't talk back to your mother, you don't talk back to that, how dare you suggest this about your father, da-da-da-da-da. And so you learned that communicating the trauma was more dangerous than participating in the self-abandonment and the self-neglect of being silent. Then you cling to an identity that may include all kinds of suppressed family secrets and this and that and the other. And so the more you cling, the more you have to act out that which is contained within the pattern that you are identifying with, which means you have got to be able to draw lines and say, yeah, that was Uncle Kenny. And no, I don't know much about him, and no, it didn't get integrated and come to consciousness because I had two parents that both looked so fierce and so frightened and so enraged anytime the topic of Uncle Kenny came up that nobody talked about Uncle Kenny. So we're all living Uncle Kenny, and it's not conscious that it's Uncle Kenny. So when I am terrified of the unknown and I cling to identity, I'm going to cling to the thoughts and feelings and patterns of behavior that I think are me because they've been in my body for a long time. And it just so happens that all the repressed stuff that I had around Uncle Kenny and that interaction never got clarified that that was Uncle Kenny because we couldn't talk about Uncle Kenny because we didn't want to be hit and we didn't want to be responsible for the breakdown of our parents. So you have a lack of support, a lack of bonding emotionally, because feelings are dangerous. They tell the truth. It's a scientific instrument. If someone is feeling hate, you know a certain amount of stuff in that environment or in that family history. It's not, in our culture, we don't break out the two, and so you know it's in the system, and you know that that environment contains elements of helplessness. Without helplessness, there's no hate. You need helplessness to be part of that mix. You also know there's going to be hurt. Without hurt, there's no hate. With helplessness and hurt and a few other tweaks, hate is an accurate reading for the environment that you're in. Now, if you can't express your feelings, then there's no language for them. Sometimes the abuse goes beyond, though, just suppressing the language of your feelings. Sometimes the abuse, the child feels hate, and there's absolutely no room in the parent's presence to communicate the hate or discover what it's about. So whatever's producing the helplessness, the hurt, whatever, doesn't get diagnosed, doesn't get adjusted. But sometimes that's not enough for particularly young, meaning they couldn't ever be themselves as parents in the family system. So you can't be yourself either. And there's different levels in this suffocating pattern. And the first is you don't get to have your own feelings. But the next wave of it means is you have to have the feeling the abuser wants you to have. And it's important to understand that when you deny feelings, you are abusing the scientific instrument of the human heart that we identify with. We say, I am having these feelings, meaning I am witnessing this instrument, refracting the energies in this way, producing these feelings. Now, the heart is no different than a color spectrometer, meaning if you produce an instrument that produces the full wheel of color, from black to white and every color at every intensity in between. If you produce an instrument that will produce a color relative to the sounds around it, then if you have a versatile environment, as you move through that environment, every single color on that color spectrometer will reveal itself. You'll go through a certain terrain that's producing this sound, and black will show up. You go through another terrain, and red will show up. You go to another red and a gray, a light black will show up, a gray. You go over to here and it's, a mix of, brown and this and kind of disintegrated and there's 2 colors showing and 3 or 4 colors showing. And that, if you want to know what sound is playing and you're deaf, a color spectrometer will allow the imagination through the extrapolation into a synesthetic paradigm, will allow you to say, okay, I see brown, that sound must be playing. Oh, there that sound is again, there's another brown. And if you start learning what brown and that sound means, every time there's brown, I start to get hungry. Every time there's blue, I start to get thirsty. Every time there's this, there's that going. Every time there's this. When you start correlating and creating a synesthetic fusion of perceived reality through the scientific instrument of the human heart, which every time you're in this situation, you feel fear. Every time you're in this situation, you feel shame. Every time you're in this situation, you feel guilt. Every time you start experiencing the full spectrum of human states which tell you what's going on. And if every time you start feeling this thing, these things tend to happen, or there's a connection between this thing and this thing, that's useful data. Because ultimately the adult is the one who witnesses and responds. And the intelligent adult is the one who witnesses and responds in such a way to increase the efficiency of transforming energy, time, money, and natural resources into human well-being. Meaning we don't consider it an intelligent human being who works very hard to cause increased suffering for themselves and other human beings. We consider it intelligent when someone, for example, designs a motor that gets better fuel economy. Elon Musk is incredibly intelligent as the operator of one of the most efficient electric motors on the planet for transforming energy more efficiently than internal combustion engine vehicles and almost any other electrical vehicle on the market with the Model 3, fixed magnet motor. The intelligence is valued because it brings well-being. It means you can travel more miles per battery. And that's considered intelligent. That is an adult thing to do, to say, okay, what's the pain? What's the problem out there? I'm seeing these colors, I'm getting these feelings, etc. Wouldn't it be nice if things worked like this? It would bring more well-being for the same unit of energy invested. Okay, let's develop the technology. Let's respond to do that. Now, if you read Elon's biography and you watch, the different news, histories, and medias, you know that in an unsupportive culture, he started getting enormous flack from all sides for the idea of inventing an electric car. In other words, the support wasn't there. Nor was there that much to regulate with, since there wasn't that much of a history. Anyway, he had to do it for altruistic reasons. When parents, particularly both parents, get the message that certain feelings equal death, and then they don't get the chance to integrate and figure out what story in human history, where was the moment where someone was about to be beheaded because they had a feeling or they told the truth? And what are they carrying in their bag? They get panic-like alarm when their child starts bringing those feelings into the space because they mirror what's going on in the environment. And as they do,